Sign these papers today, or by tomorrow morning the bank takes your farm. The woman running the neighborhood association slid the foreclosure notice across my kitchen table like she was dealing the final card in a rigged game. Same table my great-grandfather built with his own hands back in 1899, when this land was nothing but sweat, grit, and a promise that the family would never let it go. She stood there in that perfect tailored suit, wearing the kind of smile rich bullies get when they think they've already won. According to her, this land was worth a fortune now and my time was up. What she didn't know was simple. She had just declared war on the one person in town who could burn her entire empire down without ever raising his voice. 20 years earlier, I walked away from Wall Street with more money than I could spend in 3 lifetimes. I'd made my career buying struggling local banks, fixing them, then quietly stepping back while the profits rolled in. When the financial crash hit, one little regional bank in this county was circling the drain. I bought control of it for next to nothing. Never put my face on anything. Never made speeches. Never showed up in glossy magazines. I let everyone think some anonymous investment group out of New York owned it. Then I came home to the family farm, inherited 40 acres, and traded conference rooms for chicken coops, spreadsheets for tomato rows, and stress for peace. Best decision I ever made. Life out here was simple in the best way. Fresh eggs in the morning. Dirt under my nails by noon. Sunset over fields my family had worked for generations. My biggest problem most days was whether the rooster was getting too loud before sunrise. Then developers moved in. Fast. Suburbs spread like wildfire, and before long my old farmhouse was the one patch of stubborn history left in the middle of brand new streets, identical mailboxes, and freshly planted decorative trees trying way too hard to look established. That's when she arrived. The association president. Sharp, polished, ruthless. She built a whole neighborhood around my land, a neat little kingdom of expensive houses and fake smiles, and from day one my farm ruined her perfect picture. Roads had to bend around my property. Buyers complained about the smell of chickens. People moving into million-dollar homes apparently don't enjoy being reminded their food doesn't come from a screen. She tried to buy me out more than once. Offered enough money to make most people pack by sunset. But my great-grandfather's will had one line in it that mattered more than all the zeros she put on the table. No developer would ever own this land. That old man saw the future coming and he wanted no part of it. So when she showed up with papers claiming I owed years of neighborhood fees, fines, penalties, and violations, I knew exactly what I was looking at. The number was laughable. Tens of thousands in made-up charges tied to rules that did not and could not apply to my property. My land predated her subdivision, predated her board, predated every one of those carefully typed little threats. Legally she had nothing. But the papers looked official and that was the point. Stamps. Signatures. Lawyer language. Enough fake authority to scare anyone who didn't know how banking and property law actually work. Then she delivered the part that made my blood run cold. The local bank was prepared to move forward if I didn't pay. My bank. She had somehow convinced people at the very institution I owned to pressure me over a debt that didn't exist. My own employees, not knowing who I was, had handed her a loaded weapon and pointed it straight at me. She thought she was shaking down an old farmer. In reality, she had walked into a room full of gasoline holding a match. The next morning, I went to the bank as quietly as I could. Not as the owner. Not yet. Just as a confused man asking why a farm that had been in his family for over a century suddenly belonged under suburban rule. The loan officer looked nervous the second I sat down. You ever see someone trying to smile while their soul is already drafting a resignation letter? That was her. She claimed the association had supplied complete documentation proving my property had been folded into the neighborhood years ago through some legal boundary update. Everything was supposedly valid. Everything was supposedly verified. So I asked to see the original documents. That's when the room changed. Her face lost all color. She stumbled through some excuse about records being held off-site, originals managed elsewhere, chain of custody, confidential handling, all the usual nonsense people throw out when the paper trail is made of smoke. I left without arguing. Didn't need to. Because the second she couldn't produce the file, I knew this wasn't just harassment. It was fraud. That afternoon I made a few calls to people I trusted from my old life. Men and women who knew how to follow money the way bloodhounds follow scent. People who could take apart balance sheets, shell companies, inflated appraisals, hidden guarantees, and fake transactions without breaking a sweat. By evening, the first pieces were already falling into place. She hadn't just lied about my farm. She'd been pumping up values across the entire neighborhood, borrowing against fantasy numbers, signing loans on impossible assumptions, and stacking debt like a gambler convinced the next hand would save everything. And then came the sweetest part. Every oversized loan tied back to her personal guarantees. The house, the cars, the jewelry, the designer lifestyle, all of it leaned on paper-thin leverage. She wasn't trying to take my farm because she hated the smell of livestock. She was drowning. She needed one more asset, one more win, one more bluff strong enough to keep the walls from closing in. My land wasn't just prime real estate to her. It was life support. Once I understood that, the whole game changed. She started working the neighborhood hard. Held meetings. Sent letters. Whispered panic into every polished kitchen in that subdivision. She told people my farm was hurting property values, threatening mortgages, dragging the community backward. And fear did what fear always does. It spread. People started looking at me like I was a problem instead of the man who'd quietly kept to himself for years. Then one evening, an elderly woman from the neighborhood showed up at my door with an envelope in her trembling hands. Inside was a request for a sworn statement claiming my chickens and garden were creating health hazards and damaging nearby homes. In exchange, she'd been offered help with her own association fees. That was the moment I stopped seeing this as a land dispute. Now it was extortion, coercion, attempted perjury. And she'd been reckless enough to put it in writing. The next morning, I walked into a conference room at the bank carrying a briefcase full of evidence. The managers were already sweating before I sat down. I laid out the facts one by one. No shouting. No theatrics. Just numbers, regulations, signatures, missing verifications, impossible appraisals, and debt claims that had never been independently confirmed. I reminded them of something basic. A bank doesn't get to take someone's home just because a well-dressed liar hands over a folder and says trust me. They had relied on fraudulent material. They had skipped procedures. And if regulators looked closely, some of them wouldn't just lose jobs. They could lose careers. You could feel the oxygen leave the room. They tried blaming her. Said they acted in good faith. Said they relied on documentation. Fine. That bought them exactly one thing. A chance to correct it before I let federal examiners educate them the hard way. I told them to withdraw every foreclosure action tied to my property immediately and start pulling files on every major loan linked to her developments. The fake smiles were gone by then. All that remained was survival instinct. But she wasn't done. 2 days later, that same elderly neighbor came back, this time with her own foreclosure notice. Perfect payment history. Never missed a month. Still, suddenly she was supposedly in default. What? Because she refused to lie for the association president. That's the thing about predators. Once they realize they're slipping, they stop hiding what they are. They lash out. So that night I stopped playing defense. I accessed everything I legally could through the institution I owned and started tracing her communications. Emails between her and bank staff. Convenient cash deposits. Approval shortcuts. Flexible interpretations of lending rules. Then I found the kind of evidence investigators dream about. Conversations discussing compensation for favorable treatment. Real money. Real intent. Real corruption. And buried deeper still was the bigger structure underneath it all: lawyers, hidden interests, old divorce games, offshore routes, people connected to her operation who should have known better and probably did. By sunrise I had enough to make one call. I reported the whole thing. Not to a local office that might bury it. Not to some sleepy desk that would file it and forget it. I went straight to the people who handle institutional fraud for a living. Within 24 hours, federal examiners were inside the bank turning offices upside down. Files got boxed. Systems got reviewed. Loan histories got dissected. The same institution she thought she had under control became the machine that would crush her. Watching it unfold from my kitchen was almost surreal. Same old mug in my hand. Same field outside the window. Same farmhouse she wanted gone. And across town, people with badges and subpoenas were peeling apart 4 years of lies. Then the lead investigator called me with the kind of voice people get when they know they've found something big. The fraud wasn't small time. We were talking tens of millions in exposure tied to fake lending, false valuations, forged signatures, missing controls, and misused community funds. It was ugly. Worse than ugly. It was the kind of case agencies use in training when they want rookies to understand how greed rots everything it touches. But the news came with a twist. She'd started moving money. Fast. Offshore transfers. Asset liquidations. Hidden accounts. She was getting ready to run. That's when I finally played the card I'd kept hidden from everyone. I picked up the phone, issued the authority to freeze outbound international movement tied to every account connected to her businesses, and shut down her escape route before it could fully open. The investigator stared at me like I'd suddenly stepped out of someone else's story. I told her the truth. I didn't just bank there. I owned the place. Every line of credit she leaned on, every mortgage she manipulated, every financial lever she thought she controlled, all of it ultimately ran through me. You want to talk about silence? Try dropping that into the middle of a fraud investigation. After that, the strategy got simpler. Not easy, just clear. We organized. A contractor from the neighborhood gathered proof of construction shortcuts she'd buried for years. A teacher rallied residents who were sick of threats and wanted answers. The elderly neighbor became the toughest soldier in the whole operation, calling people, sharing what she knew, reminding everyone that bullies get strong only when everybody stays scared. In one barn meeting, with coffee on a workbench and files spread across old sawhorses, we mapped out exactly how to bring the whole thing down in public. The county would inspect the neighborhood. Residents would demand an emergency meeting. Financial records would be exposed. Default clauses on her personal guarantees would kick in. And if she tried to bolt, law enforcement would already be waiting. The next day was chaos in the best possible way. Inspectors rolled in at sunrise. By lunch, violation notices were piling up all over the neighborhood. Cheap work. Unsafe infrastructure. Corners cut everywhere she thought nobody would look. Homeowners started realizing the woman who sold them perfection had built half their dream with shortcuts and duct tape. Fear turned into anger, and anger turned into momentum. Then a detective called me saying he'd received complaints about my conduct, financial abuse, intimidation, misuse of authority. I almost laughed. She was so desperate she was trying to frame the victim while federal agencies were already chewing through her records. I invited the detective over, sat him at my kitchen table, and walked him through the evidence. By the time he left, he wasn't investigating me anymore. He was trying to figure out how deep her lies went. That night, the neighborhood meeting was packed. People wanted answers. Instead, they got a show. She was trying to move out. A neighbor called me, breathless, saying there were trucks in her driveway and movers hauling boxes like the house was on fire. I drove over and found pure panic in motion. Art, furniture, files, hard drives, financial records, resident information, stolen data. She wasn't just fleeing. She was taking evidence and private records with her. Lives, identities, entire families' worth of sensitive information packed into cardboard and tape. When I confronted her, she did what cornered people do. She got mean. Then careless. Said enough, implied enough, threatened enough to turn suspicion into certainty. She thought intimidation would buy her a few more hours. Instead, it gave us what we needed. I made the call. Sirens came fast. So did cameras. Apparently word had spread, because reporters started showing up right as federal vehicles rolled in. The whole neighborhood came outside. Porch lights flicked on one by one like a theater before the curtain rises. She stood there in the driveway, surrounded by boxes, trying to act like she still had control. Then she pulled out a storage device and raised it like a hostage taker with a detonator. She said it held everything. Banking information, family records, social security numbers, school data, medical records. Enough private information to ruin people for years if she released it. You could feel the fear hit the crowd all at once. Parents, retirees, young couples, everybody realizing the person who had smiled at them in meetings had been collecting ammunition the whole time. But she made one more mistake. The device was tied into systems that still ran through infrastructure I controlled. So while she was making threats, I called security and shut her digital access down in real time. One command, and the weapon in her hand became a useless piece of plastic. The look on her face when she realized it had gone dead? I'll remember that for the rest of my life. She ran anyway. Slipped toward a secondary vehicle hidden in a back garage and tore out before agents could lock the perimeter. Tires screaming, lights flashing, radios crackling. Just like that, the neighborhood tyrant became a fugitive. The next morning, we learned she'd ditched the car outside the city and made it onto a private jet under a false identity. She got out. For the moment, anyway. And that sent a fresh wave of panic through the neighborhood. For sale signs started popping up. People were terrified their homes, their reputations, their finances were all poisoned now. It wasn't just about the fraud anymore. It was about whether the community could survive being tied to her name. So that night I called everyone together. The room was packed. Fear everywhere. I stood in front of people who had spent months, some of them years, living under pressure they didn't fully understand. And I told them the truth. Their mortgages were safe. Their homes were safe. Their community was not going to collapse because one criminal in a blazer thought she could own everyone through fear. As the owner of the bank holding those loans, I personally guaranteed stability while the legal process played out. You could hear the relief. It rolled through the room like a storm finally passing. After that, something changed. People started acting like neighbors instead of isolated targets. Committees formed. Oversight rules got drafted. Emergency protections went in place. The elderly woman who'd refused to lie became the interim leader everyone trusted. The contractor organized repairs. The teacher handled transparency and communication. Residents who had once hidden behind closed doors started showing up for one another. Funny thing about communities, once the fear breaks, they remember what strength feels like. A few weeks later we got the call. She'd been caught at a luxury resort overseas, living under a fake name and spending stolen money like the story would never catch up to her. It did. Extradition moved fast once the full scale of the case came into view. Fraud. Identity theft. Conspiracy. Asset concealment. More charges than she could charm her way out of. When she came back in custody, the whole town turned out. Not because people enjoy someone else's downfall. At least not the decent ones. They came because for the first time, the truth was standing in daylight where everybody could see it. No polished speeches. No fake authority. No selective records and whispered threats. Just consequences. At the final community meeting, federal prosecutors laid out the whole scheme in plain English. Stolen funds. Fraudulent loans. Abused authority. Private data harvested and weaponized. And then came the part nobody expected. Full recovery efforts were underway, and the money taken from residents would be returned. Not some of it. All of it that could be traced. The room went dead silent for a second, then erupted. That's when they asked me to speak. So I looked out at the people in that room, families, retirees, workers, folks who had nearly been bullied into surrendering their homes, their peace, and their dignity, and I told them something simple. The day she walked onto my porch with fake foreclosure papers, she thought she was dealing with one isolated old farmer. She had no idea she was threatening the person holding together the very financial system she was trying to exploit. But even bigger than that, she had made the mistake every bully makes. She thought fear was stronger than truth. Thought intimidation was stronger than community. Thought money was stronger than memory. She was wrong on all three. Months later the place looked different. Better. The mansion she once ruled from was gone, replaced by shared green space and a community garden. The neighborhood had real financial oversight, not decorative governance. Infrastructure got repaired the right way. Families stopped whispering and started gathering. Kids played outside without their parents worrying some petty violation notice was coming in the mail. The old farm stayed right where it belonged, still producing eggs, vegetables, and a little perspective for anyone who needed it. And me? I still drink coffee at that same kitchen table. Still watch sunrise over land my great-grandfather protected long before any of this nonsense showed up. Only now, when I look out across those fields and those houses, I don't just see what survived. I see what got built after the lies burned away. Because the truth is, the best revenge isn't just watching a bad person lose. It's making sure the people they tried to break come out stronger, wiser, and impossible to control ever again. If you made it this far, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. And if you believe bullies should never get the last word, hit like, subscribe, and stick around for the next story. If you want, I can do one more pass and make this even tighter for YouTube voiceover delivery with more punchy pauses, stronger retention beats, and a cleaner 30 to 35 minute pacing.